Welcome to American Scandal Report. I'm your host, Oz Dalton, and today we're diving into one of the most shocking and least talked about chapters in US history. A chapter that forces us to confront just how far governments may go in the name of national interest. But this isn't a conspiracy theory. This is documented history, cold, calculated, and stamped with official approval. Imagine this. It's March 1962. The Cold War is boiling, paranoia is policy, and Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida, is under the control of Fidel Castro. In a quiet Pentagon conference room, top military officials are outlining a strategy. But this isn't a typical war plan. This is something far darker. They propose staging attacks on American soil, on American citizens, to manufacture public support for an invasion of Cuba. This wasn't a rejected movie script. This was Operation Northwoods, a real declassified plan that laid out how the US government might justify war through deception, even at the cost of innocent lives. Today, we'll unravel this disturbing blueprint for manufactured conflict, who created it, why it was nearly approved, and what it tells us about the hidden machinery of power. And by the end, you may find yourself asking, how many other stories like this never made it to daylight? Let's set the stage. In March 1962, a memorandum lands on the desk of Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. It arrives with all the bureaucratic formality you'd expect, marked as a preliminary submission suitable for planning purposes and bearing the innocuous title Justification for U.S. Military Intervention in Cuba. But don't let that dry language fool you. This document would become the blueprint for what we now know as Operation Northwoods. The memo begins with disclaimers. Oh, so many disclaimers. The proposed actions were stressed as being only for planning purposes, they claimed. The document was meant to serve as a point of departure. They even had the audacity to state that it would be preferable to rely on legitimate provocation as a basis for any intervention in Cuba. But here's where it gets sinister. The moment you turn the page, those noble intentions evaporate like morning mist. What follows is an elaborate detailing of fictitious grievances, completely manufactured incidents that would be blamed on Fidel Castro and his Cuban government, all designed to justify American military retaliation. Think about the psychology at work here. These weren't rogue agents operating in some shadow organization. This was the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest-ranking military officials in the United States, sitting around conference tables, methodically planning how to deceive the American people and the world. Now let's examine their crown jewel of deception, the fake attack on Guantanamo Bay. The original concept was bold but lacked detail. Operation Northwoods fixed that problem with military precision, offering an 11-point checklist for orchestrating a completely fabricated assault on America's own naval base. Picture the opening move. Clandestine radio broadcasts spreading rumors of an impending Cuban military attack. These weren't going to be random chatter. This was psychological warfare designed to build anticipation and fear. Then came the main event. Cuban exiles, described in the documents as friendly Cubans, would dress in authentic Cuban military uniforms and infiltrate Guantanamo Bay. But here's where it gets truly twisted. These fake attackers would carry out real sabotage missions on key installations. US forces would apprehend some of these actors while simultaneously staging riots at the base's main gate. Picture the theater of it all, spontaneous demonstrations designed to look like the Cuban populace rebelling against American occupiers, when in reality, every single participant would be following a Pentagon script. Then comes the explosive finale, literally. Fires would be set to destroy ammunition facilities. Aircraft would be damaged on the airfield. These same friendly Cubans would launch mortar attacks, causing real damage to real installations. They would ignite American ships in the harbor, or potentially sink vessels at the harbor entrance. And to complete this macabre performance, stage funerals for mock victims of these attacks. Every explosion, every casualty report, every tear shed at those fake funerals, all orchestrated by the very government sworn to protect American lives. The goal? To provide justification for launching large-scale military operations to depose Castro. Simple and executed to perfection, or so the plan suggested. But what if President Kennedy wasn't sold on the Guantanamo charade? Operation Northwoods had contingencies. One alternate proposal drew direct inspiration from one of America's most controversial historical moments, the explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor in 1898. The Maine's explosion had likely been an accident, but it became the rallying cry for the Spanish-American War. "Remember the Maine!" they shouted as America marched to war. The architects of Operation Northwoods understood the power of that historical precedent and proposed replicating it with cold calculation. They would sink another ship, this time deliberately, and use it as a pretext for a full-scale invasion of Cuba. But this wasn't going to be a simple sinking. No, they planned to orchestrate an elaborate air and sea rescue operation for evacuating the fictional crew of the deliberately sunk vessel. Reports of supposed casualties would be published in American newspapers to generate what the document chillingly describes as a helpful wave of national indignation. Think about that phrase, a helpful wave of national indignation. These military leaders weren't just planning to deceive the American people. They were planning to manipulate their emotions, to weaponize their patriotism and grief in service of a lie. They understood that manufactured outrage could be both a psychological tactic and a strategic maneuver. But perhaps the most shocking element of Operation Northwoods was the proposal to bring the false flag operations to American soil itself. The plan called for initiating a communist Cuban terror campaign in Miami, other Florida cities, and even Washington, D.C. Let that sink in for a moment. The Pentagon was planning terrorist attacks on American cities. The targets? Cuban exiles and refugees who had sought asylum in the United States. The very people America claimed to be protecting from Castro's regime would become pawns in a deadly game of geopolitical chess. The proposal boldly stated that the US could sink a boatload of Cubans en route to Florida, whether through real or simulated events. But it gets worse. The planners were willing to foster attempts on lives of Cuban refugees in America. They were prepared to wound innocent people with real families, ensuring these acts gained widespread media coverage. The suffering would be genuine, even if the perpetrators weren't Cuban agents. The plan included detonating plastic bombs strategically placed around Miami. Picture the chaos: explosions rocking American neighborhoods, emergency responders rushing to the scenes, families fleeing in terror, all orchestrated by their own government. These weren't the workings of foreign terrorists or rogue agents. This was the United States military planning to terrorize its own citizens. On March 16, 1962, President John F. Kennedy walked into a meeting that would define his relationship with the military establishment. The room was filled with the most powerful figures in American national security: Attorney General Robert Kennedy, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Lyman Lemnitzer, National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy, and CIA Director John McCone, among others. Notably absent from the inner circle were Richard Helms, who would later become CIA Director, and William Harvey, a CIA operative specializing in covert actions. They were asked to remain outside the meeting room, perhaps a sign that even the architects of this plan understood its controversial nature. General Lemnitzer presented Operation Northwoods to Kennedy, explaining that it could supply plausible pretexts to use force in Cuba. The phrase itself reveals the mindset. They weren't looking for legitimate reasons to act, but plausible pretexts. They were shopping for an excuse, any excuse, to launch a war. Kennedy's response was swift and unequivocal. The meeting transcript recorded his explicit dismissal. "We were not discussing the use of U.S. military force." In the restrained formality of official White House transcripts, this was tantamount to Kennedy saying hell no to the entire enterprise. But Kennedy didn't stop at rejection. He demoted Lemnitzer and ordered the destruction of all related documents. This wasn't just a policy disagreement. This was Kennedy recognizing that the very soul of American democracy was at stake. To understand the full impact of Kennedy's decision, we need to examine what happened just 7 months later. On October 22, 1962, Kennedy addressed the nation with grave news. U-2 spy planes had discovered nuclear missile sites under construction in Cuba. The world stood on the brink of nuclear war. Kennedy's handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis has been praised as masterful diplomacy that averted global catastrophe. He established a naval quarantine of Cuba and made it clear that any nuclear attack launched from Cuban soil would result in full retaliation against the Soviet Union. When Soviet ships carrying missiles approached the blockade, the world held its breath. The resolution came through secret negotiations. Kennedy agreed to remove US missiles from Turkey and pledged never to invade Cuba in exchange for the Soviet withdrawal of missiles from Cuba. It was a diplomatic triumph that prevented World War III. But many within the US military and intelligence community saw it differently. They viewed Kennedy's restraint as appeasement, as weakness in the face of communist aggression. The same mindset that had produced Operation Northwoods now criticized Kennedy for choosing negotiation over confrontation. This context makes Kennedy's rejection of Operation Northwoods even more significant. Faced with enormous pressure from his military advisors, Kennedy chose diplomacy over deception, negotiation over false flag operations. It was a defining moment that may have saved both American democracy and world peace. Here's where our story takes an almost unbelievable turn. Despite Kennedy's orders to destroy all documents related to Operation Northwoods, the paper survived. In the early 1990s, nearly 30 years after the plan was conceived, these documents inadvertently surfaced when they were discovered by the Assassination Records Review Board, an entity formed to collect documents related to Kennedy's assassination. Think about the irony. A board investigating Kennedy's death uncovered evidence of a plot that Kennedy himself had rejected and ordered destroyed. The very man who had stood against this betrayal of American values had been killed, and it was through investigating his death that we learned just how far his own military leaders had been willing to go. The discovery wasn't intentional. These weren't whistleblower leaks or investigative journalism breakthroughs. These were bureaucratic accidents, misfiled documents that somehow escaped the destruction order, hidden away in classified archives until a completely different investigation stumbled upon them. When these documents finally saw daylight, they vindicated every conspiracy theorist who had been dismissed as paranoid. They proved that yes, the US government was capable of planning false flag operations against its own people. Yes, military leaders were willing to sacrifice American lives for geopolitical objectives. Yes, the unthinkable was not only thinkable, but had been meticulously planned. Operation Northwoods didn't emerge in a vacuum. It's part of a disturbing pattern of government deception that stretches across decades. Consider the Dreyfus Affair in 1894, where Alfred Dreyfus, a French artillery officer of Jewish descent, was wrongfully convicted of treason. His supporters were dismissed as conspiracy theorists, yet years later evidence proved he had been framed by high-ranking military officials. It took until 1995, over a century later, for the French military to officially declare his innocence. Fast forward to 1964 and the Gulf of Tonkin incident. President Lyndon Johnson used this event to escalate military involvement in Vietnam. Critics who challenged the official narrative were branded as unpatriotic conspiracy theorists. Yet in 2005, the NSA declassified documents revealing that one attack had been provoked by the US itself, while the second was a misinterpretation of radar images. US News and World Report called it the phantom battle that led to war. In the 1970s, the Church Committee investigations exposed CIA involvement in assassinations and covert operations worldwide. They revealed the use of undetectable murder methods and the infiltration of American media through Operation Mockingbird. Carl Bernstein's 25,000-word expose in Rolling Stone documented how the CIA manipulated news coverage for decades. The pattern is clear. Government officials plan and execute deceptive operations, dismiss critics as conspiracy theorists, and then, sometimes decades later, the truth emerges through declassified documents or congressional investigations. Operation Northwoods fits perfectly into this historical pattern. This brings us to perhaps the most controversial aspect of the Operation Northwoods story: its relevance to modern conspiracy theories, particularly those surrounding September 11th, 2001. The parallels are striking and uncomfortable. Operation Northwoods proposed hijacking American airliners, orchestrating bombings in US cities, and carrying out assassinations, all to be blamed on foreign enemies to justify military intervention. The tactics outlined in that 1962 document bear an eerie resemblance to the events of September 11th and the subsequent wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. Now, I'm not suggesting that 9/11 was an inside job. That's not what this podcast is about. But Operation Northwoods proves that such operations have been seriously considered at the highest levels of government. It demonstrates that the same institutional mindset that produced the Cuban false flag proposal could theoretically produce other deceptive operations. The key insight isn't whether any specific modern event was a false flag operation, but rather that such operations are within the realm of governmental possibility. Operation Northwoods strips away our naive assumption that our government would never do that to its own people. The declassified documents prove that yes, they absolutely would consider it, plan it in detail, and would have executed it if not for the moral courage of one president. The true horror of Operation Northwoods isn't just in its proposed tactics, but in what it reveals about institutional thinking. This wasn't the product of a few rogue actors or radical fringe elements. This was endorsed by all the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest ranking military officials in the United States. Think about the bureaucratic infrastructure required to produce such a plan. Multiple departments, countless meetings, detailed operational planning, cost assessments, risk analyses, all focused on how to most effectively betray the American people. The banality of evil was never more apparent than in those sterile Pentagon conference rooms, where mass deception was discussed with the same clinical detachment as supply chain logistics. The plan also reveals a profound contempt for democratic governance. The Joint Chiefs weren't just planning to deceive foreign enemies, they were planning to manipulate American public opinion to manufacture the very consent that supposedly legitimizes military action in a democracy. They understood that in a free society, you need public support for war, so they were prepared to create that support through elaborate lies and staged violence. Operation Northwoods represents the complete corruption of the military's protective mission. Instead of defending America from external threats, they were planning to make America a threat to itself. The very institutions created to preserve freedom and democracy were plotting to subvert both through systematic deception and violence against innocent civilians. That's our deep dive into Operation Northwoods, one of the darkest, most audacious plans ever conceived within the walls of the Pentagon. From staged attacks on US citizens to hijacked planes and fake funerals, we've uncovered how far institutional power was willing to go. Not to defend democracy, but to manipulate it. But let's be honest, we've only scratched the surface of what documents like these force us to confront. The story of Northwoods isn't just about a failed plan from 1962. It's about what happens when fear overrides ethics, when secrecy replaces accountability, and when patriotism is weaponized in service of control. So what else might still be hidden behind closed doors? If you're ready to uncover the full truth about Operation Northwoods and the larger machinery behind America's most controversial covert plans, head over to the Skoob app now to hear the full episode. Download the app today from the App Store or Play Store and keep digging with us. Thanks for joining me on American Scandal Report. I'm your host, Oz Dalton. Until next time, stay sharp, stay skeptical, and remember, the real threat to democracy doesn't always come from the outside. It often comes wearing a flag.